200,000 years ago, a woman stands over a fire, watching her child point at a lion moving through the grass. She cannot warn him, not with a word, not with a sentence. Anatomically modern humans, the exact same species as you, same brain size, same skull shape, lived and died for over 150,000 years without a single spoken language. That sentence sounds impossible. We think of language as the thing that makes us human, the feature that separates us from every other animal on the planet. Surely a brain built exactly like ours came preloaded with the ability to talk. But the fossil record tells a much stranger story. Homo sapiens shows up roughly 300,000 years ago. Modern skulls, modern brain size, modern vocal anatomy, all already in place. And yet the first solid evidence of complex symbolic behavior, the kind that usually travels hand in hand with language, doesn't appear until a huge portion of that timeline has already passed by. So for a stretch of time longer than all of recorded human history combined, multiplied many times over, our species existed in near total silence. Here is where it gets stranger. It is not that early humans couldn't make sounds at all. They could grunt, cry out, laugh, shout a warning across a clearing. Plenty of animals manage that much. A vervet monkey has different alarm calls for different predators. A dolphin has a signature whistle it uses to identify itself to others. What none of those species have is grammar, the ability to take a small set of sounds and rearrange them into an infinite number of brand new meanings. That is the wall nothing else on Earth has ever climbed over. And for most of our own history, neither had we. The man who spent his career trying to explain why is a linguist named Noam Chomsky. In the 1950s, he proposed something radical. Language, he argued, is not a skill humans slowly picked up the way we picked up tool use or fire. Somewhere in our biology, there is a switch, a structure in the brain that either exists or it doesn't. And once it exists, full grammatical language becomes possible almost overnight, not gradually, not sound by sound, added one at a time across thousands of generations. All at once, the way a light turns on the moment you flip it. For decades, that idea stayed controversial, partly because it seemed impossible to test. You cannot run an experiment on a brain that has been extinct for 200,000 years. But new evidence, arriving from three completely different fields, has quietly started backing him up. It comes from genetics, it comes from archaeology, and it comes, strangest of all, from watching children invent a language with their own hands. Start with the genetics. In the late 1990s, researchers began studying a family in London known in the scientific literature only as the KE family. Across 3 generations, roughly half of them shared a severe and very specific speech and language disorder. They struggled to form grammatically correct sentences. They struggled to control the fine, rapid muscle movements that speech actually requires, the same way someone might struggle to play a fast piano piece with fingers that won't quite cooperate. Researchers spent years tracing the source and eventually found it, a single mutated gene, now known as FOXP2. One gene, one mutation, and an entire branch of a family tree lost a meaningful piece of their ability to build full, fluent sentences. That told scientists something enormous. Language is not purely cultural. It is not simply something you absorb by listening long enough, the way you might pick up an accent. It is wired into specific, identifiable biology, sitting in exact locations in the genome. Damage that biology, even slightly, and the whole system can partially collapse. So naturally, researchers went looking for FOXP2 in our ancestors. They found it in Neanderthal DNA too, and it was nearly identical to our own version, differing by only a handful of changes. That discovery raised a strange and uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the biological hardware for language existed far earlier than anyone had assumed, sitting there dormant in a species that never fully switched it on, or one that used it only part way. Maybe having the hardware was never really the hard part. Maybe something else, entirely separate from the genetics, had to happen to switch it on. For a clue about what that something else might look like, look at deaf children who who grow up with almost no language input at all. In the 1980s, in Nicaragua, deaf children from across the country were gathered together for the first time in a newly built school. Before that point, most of them had grown up isolated from other deaf people, each one inventing small, homemade gestures at home with their own families. Nothing close to a real, structured language. But once these children were placed together every day, something remarkable happened.
Within a single generation, without a single teacher instructing them, they built a full language completely from scratch. Grammar, consistent word order, rules that even the children themselves could not consciously explain, yet almost never broke. No adult designed this. No committee sat down and wrote the rules. It emerged the moment enough young human brains were finally given a real chance to communicate with each other. Today, linguists call it Nicaraguan Sign Language, and it stands as one of the closest things science has ever recorded to watching a brand new language get invented in real time, in front of researchers, on camera. And the deeper linguists studied it, the stranger the story became. The very first group of children, the ones who arrived at the school first, built something simple, loose word order, a workable but limited vocabulary, enough to get basic ideas across. But the younger children who arrived after them, and who learned this system as their first language from early childhood, rather than inventing it themselves, pushed it much further. They tightened the grammar. They added consistent rules the first generation had never used. Each new wave of young brains dragged the system a little closer to something resembling a full, mature human language. That single detail lines up almost exactly with Chomsky's original idea. The capacity for grammar is not something a person builds slowly through years of effort and practice. It is something a young brain appears to do almost automatically the instant it is handed raw material to work with. Give it scattered fragments of communication, and left to its own devices, it will organize those fragments into consistent rules on its own, without being told to. There is a third piece of evidence, and it comes from something far more physical than genes or grammar rules: the shape of the skull itself. Deep inside the human brain sits a region called Broca's area, tucked into the frontal lobe, heavily involved in producing speech and organizing it into grammatical sequences. Damage that exact region today through a stroke or an injury, and a person can often still understand language perfectly well, yet struggle badly to produce a grammatically correct sentence of their own. For decades, researchers assumed this region was uniquely, exclusively human. Then paleoanthropologists started looking more carefully at the inside of ancient skulls, using the faint impressions brain tissue leaves behind on bone. What they found complicated the picture. Even some much older hominin skulls, species that lived long before modern humans evolved, show early signs of a Broca's area-like bulge. That suggests the physical, anatomical hardware for something like speech may have started forming far earlier than the 300,000-year mark most people assume, which lines up again with the same strange pattern. The hardware arriving early, quietly waiting, while the actual software of full grammar took a very different, much later path to switch on. Put those three threads together, and a picture starts to form. The genetics, through cases like the KE family and the discovery of FOXP2, show that specific biology underlies language, and that this biology may have existed, at least in part, in other hominin species long before us. The Nicaraguan children show that when young brains are finally given raw material to work with, they build full grammar almost immediately on their own, without instruction, and the skulls suggest the physical architecture for speech was forming gradually, piece by piece, long before anyone actually used it to speak in full sentences. Three separate lines of evidence, each pointing toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The potential for language sat there, mostly unused, for an enormous stretch of time before something finally activated it. Now picture that exact same process, but stretched across roughly 300,000 years instead of a single generation. For most of that enormous span, small, scattered groups of early humans lived with basic sounds, basic gestures, basic warning cries, enough to survive a dangerous world, not nearly enough to build a sentence, let alone tell a story or make a plan for next season. Then, At some point, whether triggered by a small genetic shift, a subtle change in brain wiring, or simply enough humans finally living in close enough contact with each other, the available raw material crossed some invisible threshold, and the switch that had, in some form, been sitting there the entire time, finally turned on. Not gradually, not one word bolted onto another, one at a time, across thousands of patient years, more like what happened with those children in Nicaragua, a leap, compressed into a startlingly small number of generations that changed absolutely everything downstream of it. Art, religion, long-distance trade between groups who had never met, the ability to plan for a future further away than tomorrow's meal. Every single one of those things needed grammar to exist first, as the scaffolding underneath them. Which brings us back to that woman standing by the fire. For most of human history, she really did stand there in something close to total silence. Not because she was less intelligent than you are right now, not because her brain was smaller, slower, or somehow less capable. She was carrying exactly the same wiring you are carrying at this very moment, the same raw potential sitting inside her skull. She was simply born before the switch had turned on. Somewhere, an unknown number of generations later, a child was born after it did. And for the first time in the entire history of life on this planet, one human being turned to another and said something that no living creature had ever said before. No fossil records that exact day. No inscription confirms the date. There was no ceremony, no witness who understood what had just happened. But it happened quietly, in some ordinary moment that history simply swallowed whole. And every single thing you have ever said since, every warning shouted across a room, every story told around a fire, every argument, every apology, every quiet sentence running through your head as you read these words right now, is still, in some very real sense, just an echo, a continuation of that first unrecorded moment when 200,000 years of silence finally and permanently broke